I want you to imagine a Russian accent. I'm going to play a clip from a movie, and I want you to compare what you have in your head to the sound that you're about to hear.
Work for city, garbage collection, sanitation. Good benefits, but no glamour, eh?
Do you notice anything? If you're like me, it sounds exactly like it did in my head. And this trend seems to be consistent with most movies that have a Russian as the antagonist. But with movies aside, I can't think of another time that I've heard a Russian accent that doesn't sound like this. And why is this? Now, in order to understand why all Russian accents seem to sound the same, notice how I said seem, we'll get to that later, it is first important for us to do a brief history lesson. The year is 1945, and World War II had just finished. The Allies were victorious, and Adolf Hitler's reign of terror had finally been put to an end. However, during that time, a new tension was brewing between the United States of America, or USA, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, or USSR. They both had completely different ideologies, with the USA having a capitalist economic system and the USSR having a communist economic system. With their victory over the Axis powers, the allotment of global power had been shifted in their favor, and they both wanted to take advantage of it. Thus began a decades-long war between the USSR and the USA, both vying for a larger global sphere of influence. In the USA, it became very popular to portray the Soviets as villains as wartime propaganda. Hollywood was able to stereotype the Russians through film, and with time, the classic Soviet or Russian accent was born. In order to create effective propaganda, a common enemy must emerge. Their traits had to be similar, which is why the way they acted, their mindset, and their accent became synonymous with the USSR. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, there was a vacuum of power left in its place, and who better to take advantage of it than the good old US of A. Now that the USA was the global superpower, it was able to influence the world in a way that no other country could. Because of the USA's influence over the world at the moment, and because of their affiliation with the USSR in the past, it only seems like all Russian accents sound the same. But in reality, there are different Russian accents, and it has to do with their native accent. In order to explain the differences between the Russian accents, we must first go over the phonetic differences between them. The different accents in Russia are broken up into three main parts: Standard Russian, Northern Russian, and Southern Russian. We will use Standard Russian as a comparator, almost like using a generic Pacific Northwestern English accent to compare a Southern accent or my Midwestern accent. There are two main differences between Standard Russian and Northern Russian. Northern Russians pronounce their A's like O's, and their Ch like Ts. Their accent will make Mark sound like Mork, and Chain will sound like Tsen, and if you combine the two, Chart will sound like Sort. Please forgive what I'm about to do, but a full sentence would sound like Mork the Tsen on the Sort. And this is different from a Standard Russian accent, which would sound like this: Mark the Chain on the Chart. Southern accents are a little bit more complicated than Northern accents, so I'll have to explain some terminology. Standard Russian has two phonological features: consonant devoicing and vowel reduction. Consonant devoicing is where you turn a consonant that has a voice into one that doesn't. In English, this would be the equivalent of turning big into pig. Vowel reduction is where you change the typical pronunciation of a vowel when it isn't stressed. This happens in English when we say about. It doesn't sound like about, but about. These two features frequently happen in a Standard Russian accent, but not so much with a Southern Russian accent. Southern Russians do two things that are different. The first is that they turn their G's into H's, and the second is that they turn hard consonants into soft consonants, kind of like Americans saying letter instead of letter. So what does this mean for the accent? Well, it means that they pronounce gor like hor, which is really unfortunate. Unfortunately, I am not knowledgeable in Russian to give you a solid answer, but with my knowledge of phonological features, I could wager that their accent probably sounds a lot more consistent and a lot less diverse. Overall, this would mean that their accent would be thicker than if a Standard Russian was speaking English. Finally, Standard Russian is a combination of the two accents that we just discussed, and this accent would probably be the one that is most closely related to the ones in our heads. However, that isn't to say that the idea of what a Russian accent is entirely correct. As mentioned before, Hollywood stereotyped Russians, and when they did this, they made their accent a lot more harsh, presumably to make it sound more menacing. If you listen to a Russian speaking English, you'll notice that their accent can be just as thick, but not nearly as menacing. Take this guy for example.
Like Russians cannot order a smoothie because they cannot pronounce smoothie. You know what I mean by smoothie, right? The drink where it becomes smooth. Then
These two reasons aren't the only reasons for our perception of a uniformity of Russian accents. There is one more reason for this. Finally, the third piece of the puzzle is that Russian accents aren't that pronounced on their own. Standard Russian is so well established that two people speaking with one another who originate on different sides of the country could have a conversation and a third person listening in would have no idea who came from where. Only rarely do Russians have an accent when they speak, and if they do have an accent, only somebody who natively speaks Russian would be able to pick up on it, which is only like 2.3% of the population. And when I say population, I mean like everybody on Earth. This uniformity of Russian accents originates during the reign of the Soviets, who believed in a very restrictive government. The government regulated all media, including the type of language used. In fact, their stance on censorship was so extreme that they had a central censorship office in their government, known as Glavlit. Along with this, the government completely destroyed the rights of universities and schools to self-govern, with the idea that the government could run these institutions more efficiently. In other words, they could control what was taught. These past actions of the country that used to occupy Russia is the primary reason why I believe of the uniformity of the Russian accent. So, to recap everything, and to answer the question, why do all Russians sound the same? First of all, your perception on a Russian accent is probably incorrect due to Hollywood propaganda. It sounds a lot less harsh than it does in the movies. Furthermore, there are different Russian accents, but you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody with a thick enough accent to hear it when they speak English. And even if you did, it'd be incredibly difficult to pick up on it because accent recognition is not a skill practiced by many people. And the main reason that all Russian accents sound the same is because they don't have a lot of variety of accents when it comes to speaking their native language, which is a direct result of an oppressive Soviet government. So that's it for my video. Thoughts, feelings, opinions, put them in the comments. Have a great day, and if you want to see more content like this, let me know what I should cover and I'll do it. That's it from me. Let me know if you need anything, and I'll see you in the next video.